Montana Territory, 1868. The spring wind whistled through the prairie grass like a lonesome coyote, carrying with it the scent of wild flowers and distant rain. Xavier O'Connor sat atop his chestnut mare at the edge of a bluff, watching the sunset paint the vast landscape in fiery hues. At 25, he had already seen more death than most men twice his age, first in the war between the states, then as a ranch hand in a territory where justice came from the barrel of a gun more often than a courtroom. "No point in getting attached to anything out here, Penny," Xavier murmured to his horse, patting her neck. "This land takes more than it gives." The scar that ran along his jawline pulled tight as he frowned. 3 years since the war ended, and Xavier still jumped at sudden noises and woke drenched in sweat most nights. The nightmares had followed him from the battlefields to the frontier, where he'd found work at the Crooked Pine Ranch. The owner, Samuel Hadley, valued Xavier's quiet efficiency and didn't ask questions about his past. Xavier had convinced himself that the frontier was no place for tender feelings. Love was a luxury men like him couldn't afford, not when each day might be their last. Better to keep moving, stay detached, collect his wages, and eventually find a quiet place to disappear. Attachment meant vulnerability, and vulnerability got men killed in Montana Territory. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, Xavier turned Penny toward the ranch, a small knot of buildings nestled in the valley below. The lanterns were already lit in the bunkhouse, and smoke curled from the chimney of the main house. It wasn't home. Xavier didn't believe in such things anymore, but it was shelter, and that was enough. What Xavier didn't know as he guided Penny down the hillside was that tomorrow would change everything. The following morning dawned clear and cool. Xavier was up before the sun, as usual, checking the horses and preparing for the day's work. Samuel Hadley approached him as he was tightening the cinch on his saddle. "Xavier, I need you to ride into town and meet the stagecoach. My niece is arriving from Boston. Her parents passed in a typhoid outbreak, and she's coming to live with us." Xavier nodded, keeping his expression neutral despite his reluctance. He avoided town when possible. Too many people, too much noise. The stage arrives at noon. Her name is Abigail Blackburn, 19 years old, never been west of the Mississippi. Eliza's worried sick about her, making the journey alone. "Yes, sir," Xavier replied, his voice gruff from disuse. "I'll bring her back safely." The ride to Pine Ridge took just over an hour. Xavier arrived with time to spare, tying Penny to the hitching post outside the general store. He purchased supplies while he waited, exchanging as few words as possible with the shopkeeper. At precisely noon, the stagecoach rumbled into town, kicking up dust as it came to a halt. Xavier stood back, watching as passengers disembarked. A young woman in a dusty blue traveling dress stepped down last, her honey-blonde hair partially visible beneath a modest hat. She looked around uncertainly, clutching a small valise. Xavier approached reluctantly. "Miss Blackburn." She turned, and Xavier's practiced detachment faltered for a moment. Her eyes were the clear blue of a mountain stream, set in a face that spoke of both gentleness and determination. She wasn't classically beautiful by Eastern standards. Her nose was slightly too long, her chin perhaps too pointed, but there was something arresting about her expression. "Yes, I am Abigail Blackburn." Her voice was steady despite the exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. "Are you from my uncle's ranch?" "Xavier O'Connor, your uncle sent me to escort you." He took her valise and retrieved her trunk from the stagecoach. "Have you eaten?" "Not since early morning." Xavier nodded toward the small restaurant across the street. "We should get something before the ride. It's another hour to the ranch." Over a simple meal of beef stew and fresh bread, Xavier observed Abigail surreptitiously. She ate with the deliberate movements of someone conserving energy. The journey had clearly taken its toll, but she maintained a dignified composure. "How long have you worked for my uncle?" she asked suddenly. 2 years. "You're not much for conversation, are you, Mr. O'Connor?" Something that might have been amusement flickered in Xavier's eyes. "Not particularly, Miss Blackburn." "I appreciate directness." She took a sip of water. "I imagine you're wondering, why a city girl would come all this way to a place she knows nothing about. Your parents died, not much choice, I reckon. Abigail's gaze dropped to her plate. There were options in Boston. Distant relatives, potential suitors willing to overlook my lack of fortune for the sake of my family name. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. But I wanted something real, Mr. O'Connor. Boston society feels like a performance where everyone knows their lines except me. Xavier found himself unexpectedly intrigued by her candor. Most Eastern ladies he'd encountered spoke in carefully constructed pleasantries. The territory isn't kind to those who can't adapt, he warned. Then I shall have to adapt, she replied simply. The ride back to the ranch revealed more about Abigail than Xavier had anticipated. She rode side-saddle on a gentle mare from the livery stable, maintaining their pace without complaint despite what must have been considerable discomfort after days of travel. When they stopped at a creek to water the horses, she asked intelligent questions about the land, the wildlife, the ranch operations. Uncle Samuel mentioned in his letters that the ranch runs 500 head of cattle. Is that a large operation for these parts? Middle-sized. Enough to turn a profit if the winter's not too harsh and the rustlers stay away. Rustlers, are they a significant problem? Xavier hesitated. The Hadleys have been fortunate. Old man Preston to the north lost 30 head last winter. As they continued their journey, Xavier found himself pointing out landmarks and explaining aspects of ranch life, surprising himself with his uncharacteristic verbosity. Something about Abigail's earnest interest drew words from him that normally remained unspoken. When they crested the final ridge, giving Abigail her first view of Crooked Pine Ranch, she drew in a sharp breath. It's beautiful, she whispered, taking in the cluster of buildings nestled in the valley, backed by pine-covered foothills and distant mountains. It's isolated, Xavier corrected, but even he couldn't deny the picturesque quality of the scene. Mrs. Hadley rushed from the main house as they rode in, embracing her niece with tears and exclamations. Xavier unloaded Abigail's trunk, nodding politely when she thanked him before being swept inside. He led the horses to the stable, telling himself that the strange sensation in his chest was simply relief at completing his assignment. That night in the bunkhouse, as the other hands played cards and swapped stories, Xavier found himself staring at the ceiling, replaying fragments of conversation with Abigail Blackburn. Her direct gaze, her thoughtful questions, her determination. Something about her had pierced the careful armor he'd constructed around himself, and the realization was deeply unsettling. Over the following weeks, Xavier observed Abigail's integration into ranch life from a distance. Despite her Eastern upbringing, she threw herself into learning frontier skills with surprising enthusiasm. Mrs. Hadley taught her to cook on a wood stove, to preserve fruits and vegetables, to make soap and candles. Though clearly struggling with the physical demands, Abigail never complained, even when her hands blistered from unfamiliar work. One evening, as Xavier returned from checking the northern pasture, he found Abigail alone at the water pump, struggling with the heavy handle. Without a word, he dismounted and took over, pumping water into her bucket. "Thank you," she said, pushing a stray strand of blonde hair from her forehead. In the fading light, with her sleeves rolled up and her dress dusty from the day's work, she looked more frontier woman than Boston lady. "Aunt Eliza says I'll develop the necessary strength eventually." "You will," Xavier said, surprised by his certainty. "You sound confident." "You're determined. That matters more than strength out here." The words escaped before Xavier could consider them. Abigail smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "That might be the longest sentence you've spoken to me, Mr. O'Connor." "Xavier," he corrected, then wondered why. "Xavier," she repeated, and something in her voice made his name sound different than it ever had before. "Then you must call me Abigail." That night Xavier dreamed not of war, but of honey-blonde hair and determined blue eyes. The catalyst that truly changed everything came 3 weeks after Abigail's arrival. Xavier and 2 other hands were preparing to drive a small herd to the railhead at Helena, a 4-day journey. As he loaded supplies into saddlebags early that morning, a gunshot echoed from the direction of the main house. Xavier drew his revolver and ran, finding Samuel Hadley on his porch, rifle in hand, facing 3 mounted men at the edge of the yard. Abigail stood in the doorway behind her uncle, her face pale but resolute. "I told you before, Decker, this land isn't for sale," Samuel shouted. "Not at any price." The man in the center, tall, with a silver beard and cold eyes, smiled without humor. "Market's changing, Hadley, railroads coming through. This valley will be worth 10 times what I'm offering once tracks are laid." "Then I'll be 10 times richer," Samuel replied evenly. "Now get off my property." Xavier positioned himself to the side, his revolver held low but ready. He recognized James Decker, a wealthy rancher from the territorial capital who had been buying up smaller spreads throughout the region, sometimes through questionable means. Decker's eyes shifted to Xavier, narrowing slightly. "Your hired gun doesn't scare me, Hadley. I've got a dozen men who can match him." "Just passing along a business proposition," Decker continued smoothly. "But businesses have accidents, Hadley, fires, stampedes, rustling. Dangerous country." His gaze drifted to Abigail. "Pretty niece you've got, be a shame if something happened to her." Xavier stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. "You're leaving now." Something in his tone, perhaps the absolute certainty of violence it contained, made Decker hesitate. After a tense moment, he tipped his hat mockingly. "Think on my offer, Hadley. I won't make it again." As the 3 riders departed, Xavier holstered his weapon. Samuel clasped his shoulder gratefully. "Been expecting that visit," Samuel said grimly. "Decker's been pressuring everyone from here to Helena. Rumor is those who refuse tend to have misfortunes." Xavier nodded, his eyes meeting Abigail's. The fear in her expression was controlled, overlaid with the same determination he'd come to recognize in her. "The drive to Helena will have to wait," Samuel continued. "I need every hand here until we know what Decker plans." That evening, after a tense family dinner where Samuel explained the situation to his wife and niece, Xavier found Abigail sitting alone on the porch swing. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard as he approached hesitantly. "May I join you?" he asked. She nodded, making room on the swing. For several minutes they sat in silence, watching darkness settle over the valley. "Uncle Samuel explained about James Decker," Abigail finally said. "He's been buying land along the proposed railroad route." "Yes. And when people won't sell, accidents happen," Xavier finished. "Your uncle's right to be concerned." Abigail turned to face him. "I saw how that man looked at you today. He recognized you." Xavier stiffened. "What do you mean?" "He knew you." "Not personally perhaps, but he knew what you are." Her voice held no judgment, only certainty. "You've fought men like him before." Xavier stared into the gathering darkness. For weeks he had maintained careful distance from Abigail Blackburn, sensing the danger she represented to his emotional defenses. Now, with her sitting beside him asking questions no one at Crooked Pine had dared to ask, those defenses felt paper-thin. "I was a scout during the war," he said finally. "After I rode with the marshals for a time, tracking outlaws." He touched the scar along his jawline unconsciously. "Men like Decker recognize men who have killed for a living." He expected her to recoil, to make an excuse and leave. Instead, she touched his hand lightly. "You're protecting people now," she said softly. "That's what matters." Something shifted between them that night, an understanding, a connection that transcended words. As Xavier walked her back to the house, he felt the weight of her trust settle over him like a mantle. The following days brought increased vigilance to Crooked Pine. Xavier organized the hands into patrols, watching for Decker's men along the property boundaries. Samuel sent a rider to the territorial marshal, though help would be days away if it came at all. 5 days after Decker's visit, disaster struck. Xavier was returning from the eastern pasture when he spotted smoke rising from the direction of the ranch. Urging Penny to a gallop, he crested the ridge to see the barn engulfed in flames. Ranch hands formed a bucket line from the water pump, fighting desperately to keep the fire from spreading to nearby buildings. Xavier spotted Abigail in the line, passing buckets alongside the men, her face streaked with soot. Relief flooded through him at the sight of her, followed immediately by anger at whoever had done this. By nightfall, the barn was a smoldering ruin. The livestock had been saved, but stores of hay and equipment were lost. The ranch hands gathered in the yard, exhausted and grim-faced. "Wasn't no accident," Joe Dempsey, the oldest hand, declared. "Found tracks leading away to the east, 3 riders." Samuel Hadley's face was set in hard lines. "Decker." "No proof," Xavier cautioned, though he didn't doubt it himself. "I don't need proof to know who's behind this," Samuel replied bitterly. "Question is, what next?" The discussion continued late into the night. Some hands advocated for a direct confrontation with Decker. Others, including Xavier, urged caution until the marshal could arrive. As the meeting broke up, Xavier found Abigail waiting for him outside the bunkhouse. Without a word, she led him to the creek that ran behind the main house, away from the others. "You're going after them, aren't you?" she asked without preamble. Xavier hesitated. "Your uncle hasn't decided." "I'm not asking about Uncle Samuel's plans, I'm asking about yours." Her eyes reflected the moonlight as she studied his face. "I saw how you looked when you rode in today. You were afraid." The barn was burning, everyone was afraid. "No," she shook her head. "You were afraid before you saw what was burning. You thought it might be the house. You thought I might be in danger." Xavier's jaw tightened. How had this woman he barely knew learned to read him so easily? "Decker won't stop with the barn," he admitted. "I've seen men like him before. Each time he strikes without consequence, he'll grow bolder." "Then what will you do?" Xavier looked away. "I'll track the men who did this, find out what Decker's planning next." "Alone, that's dangerous." "I work better alone." Abigail stepped closer. "Why do you do that, push people away when they try to help?" "I don't need help." "Connection, someone to care whether you live or die." Frustration edged her voice. "Everyone needs those things, Xavier, even you." Something snapped inside him. "You don't understand what I've done, what I am." "Then tell me," she challenged. "Make me understand." The words poured out then, about the war, the atrocities he'd witnessed and participated in, the emptiness afterward that led him to bounty hunting, the blood on his hands that would never wash clean. He told her about the nightmares, the belief that men like him didn't deserve peace or connection. When he finally fell silent, Abigail's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "All this time," she said softly, "you've been punishing yourself for surviving." Her insight struck him like a physical blow. Before he could respond, she continued, "I may not know the frontier like you do, Xavier. I may not understand violence or war, but I understand loss. I understand feeling like you don't belong anywhere." She reached out, her fingers grazing his scarred jawline. "You've been alone because you chose to be, not because you deserve to be." Xavier caught her hand, meaning to push it away, but found himself holding it instead. "Abigail, I'm not." "I know what you think you are," she whispered. "But I see something different. I see a man who protects what matters, who fights for those who can't fight for themselves." In that moment, with the moonlight silvering her hair and her eyes holding his without fear or judgment, Xavier felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the wall he'd built around his heart. Before he could respond, voices called from the ranch yard. They returned to find Samuel organizing men for the night watch. "Decker will retaliate," Samuel said grimly from across the room. "This isn't over." Xavier nodded. "He's committed now, can't back down without losing face." "The marshal might not arrive in time," Samuel continued. "We need to consider sending the women away until this is settled." "No," Abigail and her aunt spoke simultaneously. "This is our home," Mrs. Hadley declared firmly. "I won't be driven from it." "Nor will I," Abigail added. Her eyes met Xavier's. Running away doesn't solve anything. 3 days later, a rider from town brought news that chilled everyone at Crooked Pine. James Decker had been seen in Pine Ridge, recruiting men. Rumor had it he was offering $50 each to a dozen gunslingers for ranch work. "He's building an army," Samuel said gravely after the messenger departed. "We can't match those numbers." That evening, Xavier found Abigail in the kitchen garden, harvesting late vegetables as if preparing for a siege. He watched her for a moment, struck by how naturally she now moved through ranch tasks that would have been foreign to her just weeks ago. "You should reconsider leaving," he said quietly. "At least until the marshal arrives." Abigail straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "And if I did, what would happen to you?" The question caught him off guard. "To me?" "Yes, Xavier, what would happen to you if I left? Would you stay and fight for a piece of land, for cattle, or are you fighting for something else now?" Her directness stripped away his practiced defenses. The truth was, he had stayed at Crooked Pine longer than any place since the war. What had begun as just another job had become something more, and Abigail Blackburn was at the center of that transformation. "I fight because it's what I know how to do," he said finally. Abigail stepped closer. "That's not an answer." "What do you want me to say, Abigail? That I care what happens to this place, to your family?" His voice dropped. "To you." "Is it true?" she asked softly. The vulnerability in her eyes undid him completely. "Yes," he admitted. "God help me, yes." She reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. "Then you understand why I can't leave. The people I care about are here." The intensity of emotion that surged through Xavier at her touch left him speechless. For years, he had convinced himself that men like him weren't meant for tenderness or attachment. Yet here was this remarkable woman, offering connection with her hands, her eyes, her unwavering presence. The moment was shattered by shouts from the ranch yard. They rushed back to find a rider arriving at full gallop, his horse lathered and heaving. "Decker's men," the young hand gasped. 20 riders heading this way, armed to the teeth, half-hour behind me, maybe less." Samuel immediately began organizing defenses, positioning men around the main house and outbuildings. Women and children from the hands' cabins were brought to the main house, which had the thickest walls. As chaos erupted around them, Xavier pulled Abigail aside. "Get inside. Stay low, away from windows." "Be careful," she whispered, her eyes betraying fear for the first time since he'd known her. "Abigail, the words caught in his throat. She squeezed his hand. "I know. Tell me later." The attack began just before sunset. Decker's men approached in a scattered line, using the lengthening shadows for cover. The first shots came from rifles at long range, splintering wood and shattering windows. Xavier positioned himself on the roof of the tool shed, which offered a clear view of the approaching forces. His Winchester rifle cracked steadily, forcing Decker's men to keep their distance. Other Crooked Pine defenders were similarly placed around the property, creating a perimeter of fire. For nearly an hour, the gunfight continued as dusk deepened into night. Decker's men were well armed but disorganized, clearly hired guns rather than a cohesive force. "I came here seeking something real." "You're not plain," Xavier said automatically. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "You don't need to flatter me, Xavier. I've had enough false compliments to last a lifetime." "It's not flattery," he insisted, stepping closer. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever known." Abigail's eyes widened with surprise, then clouded with doubt. "How can you say that? I'm not." "Beauty isn't just about features," Xavier interrupted, struggling to articulate feelings he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. "It's about courage, determination, the way you face each day without pretense." He reached for her hand. "I've known women with perfect faces who were empty inside. You're filled with light." Tears gathered in Abigail's eyes. "Xavier, I thought the frontier was no place for love," he continued, the words coming easier now. "That men like me were too damaged to deserve it, but you showed me I was wrong." He raised his hand to her cheek. "You showed me there's still something worth fighting for, worth living for." Abigail trembled beneath his touch. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "Of what?" "That you'll realize I'm not enough. That you'll leave anyway." She looked up at him, vulnerability raw in her expression. I may not be the kind of woman men write poems about, Xavier, but if you stay, I promise I'll love you with everything I have. Not just today or tomorrow, but forever." The simple honesty of her declaration broke the last chains around Xavier's heart. He drew her into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear if he let go. "I've been running my whole life," he murmured against her hair. "From the war, from my past, from feeling anything that might hurt. But I can't run anymore, Abigail, not from you." When their lips finally met, it was like coming home to a place Xavier hadn't known existed. All the reasons he had given himself for maintaining distance, the danger, his unworthiness, the harshness of frontier life, fell away in the face of this one undeniable truth. He loved Abigail Blackburn, and somehow, miraculously, she loved him too. 2 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Xavier O'Connor and Abigail Blackburn were married in the newly rebuilt barn at Crooked Pine Ranch. The territorial marshal himself came to witness the ceremony, along with ranchers and townspeople from miles around. The story of Crooked Pine's stand against James Decker had spread throughout the territory, turning tragedy into community triumph. Samuel Hadley, who had come to think of Xavier as a son, offered the couple a piece of land on the eastern edge of Crooked Pine property. "Build something of your own," he told them. "But stay close enough that we can help each other." As husband and wife rode out to view their future home site after the wedding celebration, Abigail leaned against Xavier's chest, his arms secure around her. "Are you happy?" she asked, tilting her face up to his. Xavier looked down at the woman who had transformed his life, who had shown him that the frontier, for all its harshness, could nurture love as well as hardship. The woman who had seen past his scars to the man beneath. "More than I ever thought possible," he answered truthfully. "You've given me a home, Abigail, not just a place but here." He placed his hand over his heart. "And you've given me belonging," she replied softly, "something real in a world of pretense." As the sun began to set over their new land, painting the Montana sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson, Xavier marveled at how completely his understanding of life had changed. The frontier was still dangerous, still unpredictable, but it was also filled with possibility. With Abigail beside him, the future stretched before them not as a lonely trail, but as a journey shared. The man who had once believed love was a luxury he couldn't afford now recognized it as the only thing truly worth having. And as he held his wife in the gathering dusk, Xavier O'Connor finally understood that some wounds could heal, some burdens could be shared, and even in the wildest places, a heart could find its home.